14 doctors had tried and failed. 50 million naira had been spent. Monitors beeped and syringes waited. A billionaire father named David Thompson paced marble halls and felt, for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. His wife, Grace, sat through nights with a small, ragged lullaby pressed to her lips, while their son Michael's breaths came shallow and fast. Money had bought them the best machines, the best surgeons, the best tests. None of it bought the answer they were desperate for. It began with a sound that never left the house: Michael's cry. At first, it was the ordinary cry of a newborn. Then, it became a signal that threaded through the house like alarm. Doctors called it a syndrome they had not yet tamed. Tests came back with pages of terminology and more questions than answers. Specialists consulted by phone and then in person. Each time a new doctor walked in, hope rose a notch. Each time a doctor left, that hope retreated a little more. David had boardroom instincts, calculations, appointments, delegations. He thought in leveraged outcomes and risk curves. For weeks, those instincts failed him. He watched as every diagnostic assumption unraveled. A pediatric pulmonologist adjusted oxygen levels. A toxicologist checked for heavy metals. A team tried antibiotics. Another adjusted formula. Machines hummed. Scans flickered. A clinical geneticist frowned over a tablet and asked for yet another blood draw. 14 consultations, 14 expert opinions, 14 gestures of sympathy that could not stitch life back together. Grace's face folded into a score of small, permanent hurts. She had given up the small rituals. Tea at dawn, the slow folding of laundry, because time now belonged to the baby. On a sleepless night, she clutched Michael and whispered things she never said when the house brimmed with guests. "I thought we had everything." Her voice cracked over the last word, like it might shatter the silence into reason. David used money the way other men used breath. He wired accounts at the blink of an emergency text. He chartered private flights so Michael could see specialists abroad. None of it worked. The bills were a suburban stack of receipts and invoices, but that stack could not be read as proof of success. It was proof only that they had tried. On a day that felt indistinguishable from the others, grey light and the steady sound of the city beyond the walls, David stepped into the car with Ibrahim, his driver, and they moved through traffic like a patrol. It was in a traffic light's pause that he saw something that made him stop the car, not because the light insisted, but because the image lodged itself like a splinter. Under the Eco Bridge, where the city's wealthy rarely looked, a boy sat on a rolled mat, feet unshod, hands stained with the dark of leaves. He mixed a small bowl of mush with a wooden spoon and pressed it into the shoulder of an old woman who nodded like a sleeping tree. People passed without glancing, indifferent to the quiet domesticity of that street scene. Yet the boy worked with a gentleness that looked like knowledge practiced for years. David watched the boy's hands, the way his fingers found veins and bones, like a reader tracing an old map. The boy's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a second there was a mutual evaluation. The man in tailored cloth, the boy in patched fabric. Ibrahim coughed, shifting in his seat. "That one?" David asked, the question a soft thing. "Yes, sir." "He's been around the bridge for a long time," Ibrahim said. "People bring him things sometimes. My neighbor says he heals." Ibrahim's voice had the cautious reverence of someone speaking of an oddity, neither ridicule nor full belief. Something in David's chest loosened, not because he trusted the child's magic, but because every other option had been exhausted. He could not bear another consultation that ended in a gentle shake of the head. He ordered the car to circle back. The encounter was small and immediate. David stepped out of the Range Rover with the faintly audible rustle of his suit. The boy looked at the car with a neutral curiosity, as if this interruption was only an expected variation in the day's work. The old woman smiled a toothless, patient smile and said nothing. David introduced himself in the clipped tones of commerce. The boy answered with a name that was like the street itself, Peter. He said it with a simple confidence that did not flatter. Can he help? David asked the question that had become a thing of private ritual, whispered at night, pressed into the hands of strangers. Peter didn't answer in words. He touched the baby's photograph that David carried. An image crumpled at the corner from the number of times it had been looked at. He asked one question instead, a question that surprised everyone. Where does he sleep? That's, Grace would later say. In the moment the question sounded almost irrelevant, a detail of routine. But it was the detail. David described the house with its rooms and air conditioning, the nursery kept at a strict temperature, the toys lined like sentries. Peter listened, nodded, and then asked to come to the house. There was a brief argument. Grace's face hardened, a barricade of fear and propriety. "We can't just bring a street boy into our nursery," she said. Staff stirred in the background. Gossip is its own river in a mansion. It began to run fast, but love is a different currency. Desperate love, in particular, can buy strange decisions. David, who had never yielded on an important matter, found himself saying, "Take him. Let him try. What do we have left to lose?" The mansion closed ranks around the stranger. Shoes were cleaned, cloths were found, and for a moment Peter stood at the threshold like a figure out of a parable. Small, unassuming, carrying only a bowl of beaten leaves in his memory. The staff watched with an array of emotions. Skepticism, curiosity, a steady human hunger for a miracle. Grace watched with arms folded and eyes guarded, not yet ready to trust what she could not control. Peter stepped into the nursery as if he had always been invited. He did not need machines. He leaned close in a way that bypassed instruments. He smelled the baby's breath, the smell of stale milk, the chemical tang of disinfectant mixing oddly with the warm, sweet smell of infant skin. He listened with a flat hand near the baby's chest, watched the rhythm of the little ribs, and then, after a long pause, he moved toys and soft boxes with a child's easy hand. He paused at a small wooden toy chest, its back pressed close against a wall that had been painted a cheerful cream. When Peter pried at the seam, a faint dust rose, and in the cracked paint there lay a darkness like a bruise. Black mold, fingers of it spreading under the surface. It had the wet, ancient smell of rot. The room's careful sanitization had missed the slow, invisible migration of a problem from the walls into the air. For weeks, the family had sterilized surfaces and changed formulas, but the house itself had been a quiet, unrecognized source. The reveal moved through the household like a current. Grace went pale. David's face folded into an expression that was part anger and part shame. The doctors were called back, formal and incredulous, each one asking to see the evidence. They crouched, clipped notes, and spat out technical phrases, their professional certainty bumping against the simple fact of the blackened plaster. "We missed this," one senior consultant said quietly, as if the admission cost him something. Peter's answer was not to offer an instant cure, but to explain gently what he had learned from his grandmother. He spoke of leaves that drew out dampness and of herbs that soothed inflammation. He described how, in the village of his childhood, houses with poor ventilation had long been treated with smoke and mixtures to restore balance. He did not denounce modern medicine. He said the words the family needed to hear. "I don't know if it will work. I only know what I know." There was a moral risk in trusting a street boy. There was a practical risk, too. A stranger touching one's child, handling a baby who had already been measured and remeasured by scientific instruments. The house staff objected on grounds of propriety and liability. The lead pediatrician, who had flown in on a private jet for a consultation, folded her arms and said it would require an approval. In the end, no sanctioned committee could outvote a father's grief. Peter stayed. That was the first part of his sacrifice. To stay was more than presence. It was an exchange. He gave up the definitive edges of street life, the refuge of anonymity, the freedom to drift, the ability to slip unnoticed into the city's margins. He traded those for the intensity of being watched, the household's pity, its suspicion, the cameras that blinked in corners. He washed and put on clothes the staff had provided, and felt for a moment like an actor in someone else's play. He felt the sting of his own identity unmoored, and the pull of responsibility like a small, steady weight. The work began with small, practical things. First, the nursery was cleared, the toy chest came away from the wall. A contractor ripped at the plaster and revealed a wider, slow spread of the dark growth. Fresh air was invited in like a guest. The windows opened to let sunlight move through the room in strips, and the hum of machines was replaced by the more chaotic and honest sounds of wind. The baby was moved into a temporary room, cleaned of the tainted air, placed where the breeze could reach him and the humidity could not settle like a film. Peter measured the herbs with hands that had learned economy. He boiled leaves not by precision, but by practice, the steam smelling of citrus and green earth. He made a poultice with no ceremony, then tested it on his own wrist before placing a small amount against Michael's skin. He spoke to the baby in a low voice, words that were as much ritual as instruction, a mixture of lullaby, instruction, and the names of plants he had learned in curving seasons. The doctors watched with a cautious curiosity. A few asked questions about the botanical names and requested samples for analysis, which the house obliged. The lead consultant said nothing outright. She took notes and kept her face unreadable. The family sat close, each heartbeat synced to the small, fragile chest beneath the blanket. They began a schedule that was modest and deliberate. For 3 days, the baby was given the mixture and moved to the fresh air room. Peter sat by the crib and kept vigil. He slept in a corner on a thin mattress, a bargaining chip he now surrendered, comfort for care. He let the house's rhythm dictate his hours and allowed for the indignities he had never known to feel heavy on his shoulders, being served food by staff who watched him as an exhibit, being questioned like an anecdote, being pitied like a wound. Day 1 passed without dramatic change. Hope is not linear, it bends and holds and sometimes snaps. That night, David left the nursery and paced in a corridor filled with paintings of ancestors who had never faced a situation like this. He folded his hands in private and felt prayer as a thing both foreign and familiar. He thought of every boardroom victory, every contract signed, and realized those triumphs were small when placed against the fragility of a child's breath. Day 2 brought a flicker. Michael's eyelids fluttered more often, and his gaze found shapes. Grace wept a little at midday when his eyes opened to follow her hand. The nurses charted vital signs and exchanged looks with the pediatrics team. No one declared victory. Instead, they measured and noted the trained habits of professionals meeting the wary gratitude of a family that had been trained to expect disappointment. On the 3rd morning, Michael smiled, a small, thin bloom that cracked the household open. It began as a mouth shape, and then a laugh, soft at first, and then a clear, ringing sound that filled corners that had been dusted with sorrow. People gathered like swifts to a river. David dropped to his knees without thinking about the optics or the cameras in the foyer. He pressed his forehead to the carpet and made a sound that was equal parts prayer and surrender. Grace's cry was loud enough to startle the staff into silence and then into a slow, stumbling joy. The house erupted, but not into the vulgarity of ostentation. It was a humble joy, hands clasping hands, tears wiping cheeks, a baby's laugh as a currency of healing. The doctors, professional and measured, allowed themselves a smile that softened their practiced faces. One of the visiting consultants touched Peter's shoulder and said, voice low, "You were right to ask where he slept." Peter's sacrifice had been made visible in increments. He had given up the things he had used as a shield, a life off the grid, the small freedoms of a boy who sleeps where he can find rest. the anonymity that let him pass the city's roughness without greeting. He had taken on the burden of being known, his past, his scars, his poverty, visible to strangers. He had given his time and his nights, leaving the bridge and the old woman's mat. He had, most of all, risked his dignity by entering a world that could reject him wholly for its class lines. That kind of sacrifice is not dramatic by violence. It is quieter and sharper. It is the cost of vulnerability. When the initial elation settled, practicalities returned. News traveled in a city like a rumor, and the story of the boy who helped the billionaire's child became something talked about in markets and cafes. Researchers at a local university, University of Lagos, contacted the household to request samples. They wanted to study the leaves and the components that had been used. Their language was careful and measured. Compounds that may have anti-inflammatory properties, elements that could reduce certain airborne irritants when combined with ventilation. The scientists were careful not to declare miracle, but they did not dismiss the possibility of useful medical insight. David listened to the researchers with a new kind of attention. The man who once measured value in quarterly returns began to measure it differently, in pupil dilation and in the brightness of a child's laughter. He sponsored the analysis with funding that would have once been earmarked for less necessary ventures. He also did something less quantifiable and more radical. He asked Peter what he wanted. There was no hesitation when Peter answered. He did not ask for money to buy a house or garments that could pass as armor in polite society. He asked for schooling. "Teach me reading," he said softly, "so I can learn more to help other people like my grandmother taught me." The request was precise and quietly courageous. He was not seeking a trophy that would tie him to David's name. He wanted the tools to build a life that was not hinged on survival by hunger. David's promise was public and private. He set up a scholarship and hired a small team to oversee Peter's schooling and integration. He offered housing to the old woman who had been Peter's guardian, a modest but dignified apartment where sunlight could come at midday. He gave the household a long, careful conversation about dignity and respect. And he told Grace that forgiveness for his earlier arrogance was owed to those who had wisdom in places their pedigree had never taught them. The scientists published a modest report. Their tone was cautious and professional. Analyses of compounds that appeared in the leaf mixture suggested anti-inflammatory properties and potential for affecting certain kinds of environmental irritation. They stipulated the need for controlled trials and ethical oversight. The headlines, when they came, were breathless on one side and skeptical on another. The family did not turn to the press as a source of meaning. They kept the story within the house's own new orbit. Michael's health, Peter's schooling, a new roof over the old woman's head. There were critics, as there always are. Voices on the radio asked why it took a street boy to see what highly paid specialists did not. Some reporters wanted drama, an expose of negligence. The family faced those questions with a careful humility. David spoke about responsibility and about how easy it is to overlook the obvious when one is trained to look elsewhere. Grace, when asked, said little, but when she did speak, she said, "We were given the answer in a place our pride kept us from looking." Peter's life changed in ways both large and small. He learned to read in a classroom that smelled of books and lemon polish. He sat in desks next to children who had different accents and different lunches. He learned to navigate the strange economy of schoolyard hierarchies. There were days he missed the bridge, the informality of the mat he once called his bed, and the quiet smile of the old woman as she boiled the bitter-leaf tea. Yet in his new life, he found a different kind of family. Teachers who asked about his past, with the tender curiosity of those who have been asked to bear other people's truth. Classmates who learned to listen to a story they had not known. And Michael, who grew into a toddler who chased sunlight and fell down and was always kissed back to comfort. David changed as well. He still ran companies and signed deals, but his conversations now included a measure of people that had previously seemed incidental. He instituted a community outreach program that focused on environmental health in low-income neighborhoods. He funded programs that trained local healers to work with public health officials, not as relics to be replaced, but as resources to be respected and studied. He learned humility in a way that boardroom metrics could not calculate. In private, David kept a small photograph in his wallet. Peter, hair damp, grinning like a boy who had learned to love a life he had not chosen, but now cherished. He looked at that image when decisions were hard. He sometimes wondered how close he had come to losing everything he loved for the pride of not admitting ignorance. That question was a kind of penance and a kind of gift. The household kept its rituals. They celebrated birthdays, not with extravagance but with care. Michael's first steps were cheered by people who had once been strangers. The old woman visited daily and taught Peter new recipes and songs, her hands steady with knowledge. She called him my son, and sometimes in the hush of the late afternoon they would sit together and talk about rain and the scent of earth. The city watched, and then the city turned the lens outward. Community clinics began to look at houses with a new scrutiny for mold and ventilation. A local non-profit used the family story as impetus to fund housing repairs. It was not a simple direct line from one event to sweeping change, but one life's rescue had a ripple effect. Teachers trained, contractors employed, families given modest grants to fix leaking roofs and improve airflow. It was a small, tidal change in a larger ocean of need. The word sacrifice lodged itself into the retellings and retold versions of the story. Some used the expression loosely, as if Peter had given up something trivial. Others thought of sacrifice as the loss of life or limb. In truth, Peter's sacrifice was of a different grain, the surrender of a boy's right to remain unseen, the decision to stand in a glare of scrutiny, the quiet giving up of the only survival system he had known. It is a sacrifice that leaves the body intact, but rearranges the soul. It had an emotional cost that sometimes made him flinch, an ache of belonging that comes with exposure. There were moments of awkwardness. Old friends from the bridge came to the house and were turned away politely by security protocols. Peter learned how to explain his choices without sounding like a convert and without diminishing where he came from. He found ways to bring his knowledge to clinics in slums, to teach simple measures of ventilation to mothers who could not afford contractors. He learned to carry both his past and his present with a steady gait. For David and Grace, the hardest lesson was in recalibrating what value meant. The couple had once believed that provision was proof of love, that to buy everything was to love fully. The baby's illness taught them otherwise. They discovered that love requires listening and humility, and the willingness to be wrong and to be changed. David's public kneeling was not a photo op. It was a private surrender made public out of gratitude. He thanked in the way a man who had been saved might thank, awkwardly, sincerely, and without the attempt to map that gratitude onto future transactions. Years later, when Michael was old enough to understand the contours of the story, he asked Peter why he had come. Peter, now a young man who taught in a local clinic, told him about his grandmother and the way the leaves smelled in the rain. He told him about nights on the bridge and how a baby's breath can sound like a prayer when it is nearly gone. Michael thought about the number 14, an odd pivot point for the memory. 14 doctors, he said with a child's simplicity. Does that mean they tried everything? Peter smiled and shook his head. They tried everything that lived inside hospitals, he said, but sometimes a house can be sick too. The story did not end with applause. The researchers continued their studies with careful trials and ethical oversight. Their reports remained cautious. Certain compounds in the herb mixture showed promise for reducing inflammation under specific conditions, and ventilation is a known factor in environmental health. They urged controlled studies. They did not pronounce miracles. They pronounced possibilities and the need for further study. That measured language suited the family fine. What changed them most was not the academic validation, but the human one. A boy who traded his street for a classroom, a family who learned where humility begins, and a city that in small and careful ways began to look at the places it had ignored. The mansion kept its marble and its art, but the people who lived there found new value in the unadorned things. An afternoon breeze that carried away the smell of illness, the sound of a child's laughter, a boy learning to read. If there is a single image that lingers, it is simple and stubborn. Peter, sitting at a small desk, a schoolbook open, sunlight catching his hair, and across the room a video on a tablet playing footage of a little boy, Michael, chasing a red ball. David watched all of it with a look that belonged to someone who had learned a hard lesson, that riches can buy almost everything, but humility and the willingness to learn can buy a kind of salvation that money had not taught him to value. The city told the story in volleys, some with admiration, some with cynicism. But most mornings, at the place where the bridge met the road, people who had known Peter from the start saw him walk past, not as a spectacle, but as a neighbor. He visited the old woman's apartment and helped at the clinic. He taught mothers how to spot signs of damp and how to seek help early. He refused almost always to speak of himself in grand terms. He talked about leaving the street as a hard thing and an honor. "I gave up my freedom of drifting," he told a school audience once, "to be accountable to someone's life." The final lesson clung not to the dramatic language of miracles, but to a quieter truth. Wisdom does not wear a uniform. It does not always come with degrees or medals. Sometimes it comes on calloused hands that have known need and learned its answers from the slow work of living. The Thompsons learned that to value a person is to recognize knowledge wherever it dwells. At the end, when the story had been told and retold and spaced into memory, David stood in a small crowd at a community center and said, "We were humbled." He did not use the word showily. He let it sit. We were humbled by a boy who had nothing to gain and everything to give. Grace, standing beside him with Michael, now a bouncing, loud child, clasped Peter's hand and said plainly, "Thank you." Peter's answer was quiet. He looked at Michael and then at the family that had become a kind of new kin. "I only did what I learned," he said. "I only gave what I had." His words carried the weight of someone who had paid a price that could not be counted in money. If Peter's act is called an ultimate sacrifice in the sensational headline, the story insists on nuance. His sacrifice was ultimate in a certain moral economy. It cost him the only life he had known and replaced it with responsibility, exposure, schooling, and the pressure to live up to a promise. That kind of giving is rare and exacting. It demands courage without the romance of martyrdom. It is a slow, steady surrender that remakes a person. For those listening now, the story holds a gentle set of teachings. Look for knowledge in places your assumptions exclude. Value people for what they know, not for what they own. Be willing to surrender pride when the life of a child is at stake. And when someone unexpected offers wisdom, listen and then act with care. If this story moved you in any small way, subscribe for more true-feeling stories that remind us how fragile and beautiful human life can be. Years later, Michael would run toward a small clinic where Peter taught, and the two would laugh like old friends. The house that once hosted machines and monitors became, in its modest, quietly heroic way, a place where lessons about humility were stuck to the refrigerator like magnets. Outside, neighborhoods learned to watch their walls for the slow invasions that happen in silence. Inside, a family learned to fold their hands in thanks without making gratitude into a ledger. The narrative leaves room for more study, more care, and more listening. Scientists will continue to ask cautious questions. Communities will continue to face stubborn problems like damp roofs and underfunded clinics. But there is a human truth in the arc from fear to recovery that does not require a lab to confirm. Sometimes the door you need to open is the one you have been too proud to check. So when you think of 14 doctors and 50 million naira and a crying child with breath like a prayer, remember the boy under the bridge who mixed leaves and the grandmother who taught him what she could. Remember a father who learned to kneel and a mother who learned to welcome help from an unexpected place. Remember that sacrifice is not always loud. Sometimes it is a small hand pressed to a child's chest, staying through the night, choosing to be known and accountable. If Peter's bravery moved you, like and comment below what lesson you learned. Subscribe for more stories of unexpected wisdom and quiet courage.